Hi everyone, welcome to your flipped classroom video, continuing a little bit of classical pedagogy, but also updating you, bringing things up to date and having a look at a few more recent contemporary theorists and theories. So here we go. Let's have a look at the theorists and theories we're covering. In this session, we're going to look at Schurman, and he identified 7 different types of knowledge that is important for a teacher. We're going to focus on a couple. We're going to look a little bit about information processing theory, a bit about Tony Buzan, who worked a lot with memory and mind mapping, and who built on IPT. We're going to try and theorize limo a little bit, because it's this kind of abstract 4-word formula that I've presented to you in the first week, and I want to show you in a sense that it has a basis in theory and builds on other people's models that have been out there. We're going to look at the debate in a sense between sort of traditional educational theorists, not traditional as such, but educational theorists that have advocated a kind of experiential, skills-based learning, such as Dewey. We're going to contrast him with some more recent theorists that are really advocating for the place of knowledge, different types of knowledge, and they have different approaches. The first of those is Eric Hurst Jr. And his Core Knowledge Foundation. The second is Michael Young and what he calls powerful knowledge. We're going to have a look at those two and critique those two and show those two influence their influence in today's both curriculum and schools. Going to have a look at Roger Hart's ladder of participation, really important for active citizenship and change making and what have you, the degree to which young people themselves should be autonomous in leading, developing and building projects. We're going to have a look at learning styles. So it's become kind of ubiquitous within education that there are particular learning styles and students have a particular learning style. We're going to have a look at that and try and see whether or not there is actually evidence for that. We're going to go back to the very first day of the PGC, have a look at David Kolb and his experiential learning cycle, and also something called, linked to the previous point, something called the Learning Styles Inventory. And perhaps, it depends, it's kind of 10 o'clock when I'm recording this the night before a lecture, so it depends. If we get time, I might move on to Lawrence Kohlberg. Again, he's a classical theorist, really. He died in 87, age 60. But he had a lot to say about children's moral development and how you support that development as a classroom teacher. And we're going to look at, some of you might have come across it before, something called Heinz's dilemma. But anyway, there we go. So that's what we're covering today and who we're covering today. Just to say that a lot of this, if you want sort of easily accessible summaries of some of these theories, and in particular the classical theories, have a look in chapter 4 by Daniel, I don't know how to pronounce the second name, in Preparing to Teach in Secondary Schools. Similarly, chapter 5.1 by Diana Burton in Learning to Teach in the Secondary School, 7th edition. There's also a couple of kind of books that summarize a range of learning theories. I rate Understanding and Using Educational Theories more than I do Learning Theories Simplified, because quite frankly, Bob Bates isn't an educationalist himself, and sometimes either focuses on not quite the right thing or oversimplifies to the point of it not being particularly accurate or useful. So anyway, so there we go. A few books that your first port of call. Remember, there'll be a reading list at the end of this. This will also exist in PowerPoint form in Subject Studies 9. 8 or 9, I'll put it in one of them, so that you can get the links and review things at your own pace. Remember that it's probably best to take notes when you're watching this. Again, I'd advocate a theorist and then how, lessons you can take and apply to the classroom from that theorist. So there we go. why am I showing this picture? So hopefully by now we will have had a look at this, and in one of your sessions about creating learning experiences, lesson planning and what have you, and we will have broken down the steps you need to take as a teacher when planning or organising a learning experience into 3 basic questions: where are students at, where are they going, how do they get how do they get there, excuse me. And I'm trying to think where so B, where are they going? This is really influenced by Bloom, and we'll do a lot of work hopefully in those sessions on Bloom, and ensuring that when you kind of write the destinations that students are going to get to, you write them in accessible and what I've called here accountable language. Anyway, the kind of key area I think that this flipped classroom video focuses on is how do they get there. So the kind of learning activities students might engage with in order to learn what it is you want them to learn. So this here, I mean, I think I'll have explained it in the session, but this is just a visual representation of different approaches you could take. Start a main plenary. This is representing a whole lesson just based on one limo sequence. So link in, mix, out, and you'd have the out towards the end of the lesson. But actually you can do a number of limo sequences in any given lesson. So you learn the first thing, you teach the first thing, you link to students' experience, you present them with new information, they process that through a range of activities, and then they demonstrate it. Once they're done on that, they move to the second, do the same, the second thing that you want them to learn, and then the third. So limo doesn't just have to be fixed to a lesson, it also could be more than a lesson. It could be stretched across a number of lessons. Other formats, you might have present, apply, review. I don't know quite why I put linky in, mixy, and outy, but I think what I'm saying here is that whole thing about limo not being a straitjacket, and actually the lines between these phases being a little blurred, and blurred in the sense that you can have overlapping elements at any one point. You can have some activities which would cover in, mix, and out, or link and in, or mix and out, etc., etc. And here's some examples of different approaches to learning and what have you, some of which we'll go through today. Okay, let's move on. I have not done custom animation on this slide, but anyway, so let's head to our first theorist. This is quite quick. Essentially, Lee Sherman, back in 87, 30 years ago now, wow, he categorized teacher knowledge into 7 categories, and the 2 important ones for us really are general pedagogical knowledge, which he described as principles and strategies of classroom management and organisation across curricula, and pedagogical content knowledge, the knowledge which integrates the content knowledge of a specific subject and the pedagogical knowledge for teaching that particular subject. Okay, and in a sense, I think I can best explain this. There's a link here if you want to follow that, to go and have a look at the other categories of knowledge or teacher knowledge. I hope, and I can't remember exactly what all 7 are, but you'll have knowledge of students in there. You'll have specific subject knowledge rather than pedagogical content knowledge, and a range of others. But anyway, the way to think about this is essentially your professional studies, your keynotes. A lot of them, like for example today when you had, I'm recording this on Wednesday the 19th of September. So today you will have had a lecture on assessment, and that would generally fall under this category of general pedagogical knowledge, versus a lot of the subject study sessions I will run. We might do a session on assessment, but it will very much be focused on how you embed those principles, those general principles, into the subject of citizenship and related humanities and social science subjects. That's the general distinction. there we go. So that was Lee Shulman's contribution. Moving on to IPT, and it looks as if I haven't actually done any custom animation on any of these slides. Anyway, this wasn't a theory created by Muigis. He's the guy from earlier whose second name I couldn't pronounce. But it is covered a little bit in that overall preparing to teach in the secondary school book. But essentially, IPT is important because I think it's becoming quite influential in some schools. And I think it's important for Limo. We'll come on to that in a second. But essentially, IPT suggests that there is a 3-stage memory system, that you start off basically through your senses, filtering a whole load of information that is constantly coming your way in life, and you generally focus on what is important, and your brain at any given time will focus on the most important things. Hence the attention bit in this little diagram. So most is filtered out, but some comes in, and obviously, in order to help students remember things and to sort of gain their attention, you need to develop as a teacher learning experiences and linkages to their experience or what have you that are unique and different and multisensory and will actually capture their attention. So it's worth remembering that they've got a lot going on, a lot they can potentially be thinking about or whatever, even within a classroom, and how you're going to grab them and ensure that their attention is on exactly what you want. And that's a huge combination of different things, but it's worth bearing in mind how you might go about that. Second stage of the IPT is working memory, and that's effectively known as short-term memory. And IPT posits that practice and prior knowledge can impact the capacity of that working memory. So the amount of information you can store and use. If you exercise your brain more, if you build your knowledge base, I guess, you can expand the capacity of working memory, and therefore do more, I guess, as a student in the classroom and what have you. But the key thing is here that that in order to embed knowledge in your long-term memory, so to move it from your short-term or working memory to your long-term memory, you need to go through significant processes of practice, review, and recall to embed it in there. And to some degree, that's led to some schools really focusing on practice and rehearsal and what have you. I mean, the language classroom is in a sense the best example of that, but there are schools, and we'll go on to give a few examples later on, who are really focusing on repetition and embedding through recall and whole class kind of oracy and quizzing and what have you, as a means to really test and embed knowledge in long-term memories. So that is your basic introduction to information processing theory. I mean, I would say that while practice, review, and recall are all good, and you can, in a sense, take the most boring information and through practice and recall and doing some, interesting techniques, using mnemonics, using song, using rap, using mind maps and what have you, you can embed it in your brain. I think just IPT on itself, by itself, isn't enough. It's not enough for all the students that you might teach who have a wide variety of needs. You still need to make learning to grab students and grab their attention. You still need to offer them experiences which are multisensory and divergent and not always following one particular learning style preference. So yeah, variety is the key, and those experiences that are memorable, that are multi-skilled, so project-based learning. What I'm not talking about in this video, but at some point we'll talk about soul and self-organized learning environments, but and also discovery learning, those kind of things, still absolutely have their part to play, because they, in and of themselves, without needing necessarily to go through this process of review and recall, they will embed things in long-term memory. Because you think back to the most significant experiences of your lives, you will remember the things that stood out in a multi-sensory way. And it's the same in the classroom or beyond the classroom. So anyway, there we go. Big proponent of IPT was Tony Buzan. And if you just Google mind map and go into mind map in Google Images, you'll find a lot of Tony Buzan inspired mind maps. Anyway, he studied and taught how to improve memory. And he said that memory is improved when information is, number one, associated with something already known. So in a sense, he's a constructivist along the lines of Piaget, in a sense, because Piaget was all about knowledge being constructed, in the brain, and to some degree based on what is already known, assimilating new information, or adapting one's worldview according to the new information that's coming in. So hence accommodation. Anyway, and he also says, if it's outstanding or unique, it will be remembered. So he kind of came up with a formula for how you do that, and a whole list of rules about how you might mind map, use of image, the thickness of lines, and all these kind of things, building associations between your short-term and your long-term memory, hence mind mapping. So anyway, he also talked about rehearsal and practice being important. So there we go. And I think it is worth having a visit of Tony Buzan's work, just to support students in their, if they can develop healthy practices of taking notes, of mind mapping, of attempting to recall, embed knowledge in their long-term memories, from the beginning of their schooling experience, then isn't that great? It would be great to do that much earlier on and consistently throughout their school experience, rather than just when they come, to revise a GCSE. So there we go. Tony Buzan. I wanted to talk a little bit about theorizing limo. I just also want to check that we're still recording here. Yeah, we are. Theorizing limo. It is important to actually show, I think, that the link in, mix out model is one which is kind of rooted in educational theory, although I've presented it without any theory almost. So here we go. Well, hey, at last. Oh, but I've done it in completely the wrong order. Never mind. Okay, where are we? So first of all, it is not a model that is widely known. It was created by me. And all I wanted to do was make the teaching and learning process a bit more memorable and accessible for you folks, okay? Hence LIMO. You're not going to forget LIMO, that acronym. But it does build on a number of models of lesson planning and learning. And I mean, when I created it, I had no idea these models existed. But since I've gone back and had a look what's out there in the literature to try and find things that connect to LIMO. Anyway, so Jeff Petty, you can Google search the guy. He's an educationalist. He had a present, apply, and review model, which in a sense mirrors the in, mix, and out model. You've got Gagne's 9 events of instruction. There's a little link here. You can find that through the PowerPoint. Again, those 9 events actually mirror, if you're to summarize them, LIMO. You've got Madeline Hunter's 7 Considerations for Lesson Planning. That's from quite a while ago. And again, that actually follows a limo pathway. And an uncredited, but you can find it out there. There's a so-called 5 E's model of sort of planning learning experiences. Engage, explore, explain, extend, and evaluate. And in a sense, you can see how engage is going to be a link. Explore, explain, and extend. Well, explore might be your in. Explain and extend might be your mix. So you're doing something with the base knowledge you've developed during the in, and then evaluate would reflect the out, where students might be reflecting on their experiences and certainly demonstrating what they've learnt by doing so, and you'd be checking what they've learnt. So there we go. There's a number of models which actually reflect that limo process. I just think limo is easy to remember, and so that's why we roll with it. So there we go. Now you can also you can also think about each different phase and say, well, what have people had to say about these different phases? So let's have a quick look, and this is just a few people, some of which you'll have heard of, some of which you aren't familiar with, you may not be familiar with, to kind of demonstrate that each individual phase is also rooted in theory or theorists. So a good book, I would recommend it. It's part of an outstanding teaching series of books. There's this one, Engaging Learners, and there's another one called Teaching Backwards, which I both think are great reads, by Griffiths and Burns. They have what they call 8 triggers of intrinsic motivation in this book. Okay, 8 triggers of intrinsic motivation, and the first is relevance. Well, not the first, but one of them, a central one, is relevance and making learning relevant to young people. So again, they're just talking about the link. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about hooking, engaging, connecting students to learning. Dan Willingham, in his kind of famous book, Why Don't Students Like School, or Why They Don't Enjoy Learning, he says that teachers often overload learners with the irrelevant and unimportant and fail to direct learners' attention to what really matters. And that's the key here. So in this link phase, you are directing students to what matters. You are highlighting the why this is important, and really making things relevant to students. So that he would definitely go in that zone. I like this quote as well, because this is talking about building on student experience. So Jensen, in his excellent book, it's based on students and teaching in the United States, but it's called Engaging Students with Poverty in Mind. He says, based on the work of Lindsay, Carnes and Mayat, when teachers remain ignorant of their students' culture, students often experience a demotivating disconnect between the school world and their home life. And it is so important, in my view, to bring that life and that lived experience into the classroom, connect to it, but then build on it, not just exist there. Absolutely take students to new places and new worlds and address new concepts, but start with a concrete reality, which is often based on where they may be at or where they're not, where they may what they may know. So you need those connections, those roots to their reality before you extend it into more abstract notions and what have you. So there we go. I think he appears there. Then we'll think about in a little bit. Actually, crossovers between the two. We looked at a number. I know you will have looked at the classical pedagogy flipped classroom video already. Ozubel, I think, is my dodgy pronunciation. He was a big proponent of relevance and building on student knowledge, and metaphor is a good example of that. So taking something known to the student to explain a process or a concept, unknown. Well, hitherto unknown. So Uzabel is a good example. Another good example is Piaget in himself, because the whole notion of constructivism is built on connecting to what students know, and students cognitively kind of breaking down and trying to make sense of new knowledge that is coming to them based on what they already know. So that spans both link and in. So there we go. Now the mix, I've kind of already talked about this, but IPT is very much spans the in and the mix, but it very much says you need practice of recall, you need practice to embed things, you need stimulating, interesting activities to allow students to embed knowledge in their long-term memory. So IPT absolutely is at home within Limo. Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy of the cognitive domain absolutely connects to link in, mix out. You could argue, I'm not really doing that here, that the in could be the presentation of lower order Bloom Bloom categories. The mix could be slightly higher order application and analysis activities. And then often, if you've given students opportunities to synthesize work, to evaluate positions and what have you, that's often what they end up demonstrating through presentations or extended writing pieces or what have you. So you could say that Bloom kind of follows in mix or out, or you could say, but that doesn't always apply. So you could also say that within mix, often what you do is you get, within the in you get new information, but then within the mix, it is often where you apply that new information to a case study or what have you. So that's why I've put here application tasks often fit in here. And I put the plus to indicate, actually all sorts of different categories could fit in here. It kind of depends on what you're trying to teach students. But anyway, but I do think Bloom is important. Bloom's taxonomy, that is important to connect to Limo. Okay, finally, not finally, Vygotsky and his whole notion of opinion being socially derived often, and communication and social communication being key to learning, absolutely fits with Limo, because it's a kind of the social dimension is the dimension you need to think about when presenting knowledge and enabling students to process it. So often students will learn from other students, so that their in will come from other students, and often it is important, particularly within citizenship, to allow students to discuss and consider different opinions, but do so socially, in pairs, in groups, to allow them to master particular bits of knowledge or particular opinions or particular skills. So I really do feel that Vygotsky sits really well within Limo. Finally, the whole notion of teachers understanding where students have got to, understanding the progress of students by students demonstrating in some way then their progress, and allowing the teacher to check progress. I mean, that at its heart is assessment for learning, because based on that feedback, a teacher will then either if they haven't learned stuff, to go back, maybe do different mix activities, maybe even present the knowledge again in a new way, or the skills in a new way, if they can see that it hasn't been learnt, or it's about moving to the next stage and the next bit of knowledge if they can see it has been learnt. So AFL absolutely flows through Limo. So there we go. So there's a few, I hope that's useful, a few classical and more recent educational contributions sort of broken down into limo. Okay, applications then. We know that limo can work as a learning sequence. I've talked about it can be very short, across a full lesson or more. It shouldn't be a straitjacket for every lesson, let's say. It can be a guide for a lesson, but not a straitjacket. Don't think of it as, I've got to do this, and then this, and then this. The bits may flow. The key thing is that you present some new information at some point, somehow. Again, it doesn't have to be by you. Students have an opportunity to practice and embed that and apply it, and then they have an opportunity to demonstrate that they've learnt whatever it was you were setting out to teach them. Okay, we've talked about the rejigging of the order and what have you, and the fact it can overlap and meet multiple purposes. Fine. I personally find it's a really useful tool. When I come in and observe some of your lessons, often I'll refer back to limo because there may be key parts in the lesson where maybe new information hasn't been given. It's been assumed that students might know something, but actually they're missing this, or actually some new information's been given, but then there's no real opportunity to practice or conduct some activities which help them really embed and learn that information. So that might be the problem, or maybe the lesson's moved on before the teacher's really checked and the students have demonstrated whether or not they've learned something. So the whole rest of the lesson falls down because it's not built on an earlier bit of student learning. Anyway, so it's a useful tool to observe lessons and to kind of see where there might be issues and what have you. The final thing to say is that in a sense, a teacher's job is to kind of gauge whether or not the students are picking up on this new information or new knowledge, new skills, all the way through, and not just right at the end. Now, that limo phase might have taken 10 minutes, it might have taken an hour, but if it has taken an hour, you as a teacher, or a full lesson, you as a teacher wouldn't just wait until the last 10 minutes to check whether or not they're learning. You do it as you're talking, as you're presenting, as the video is playing, as students are reading a textbook or what have you. So all the way from the in, through the mix and the out, you're kind of checking understanding. So AFL isn't just at the end, it is running all the way through. Important to remember. Okay, now we get into more contentious areas, I feel, by looking at the increasing centrality, particularly since 2010, and then the introduction of the new curriculum, 2013-14, or the most recent curriculum, national curriculum. We're looking at the increasing centrality of knowledge, okay? And whether or not it has moved to centre stage. What else, has anything been lost as a result from the curriculum, from what schools are doing? Anyway, the first person we're going to look at is Eric Donald Hurst Jr. He's a professor, an educator from the States, and he's the founder of something called the Core Learning Foundation. And in the States, he has Core Learning Foundation schools, literally schools, who have adopted his method and very rigorously follow what he set out. But what did he set out? Let's explore. Well, he said, knowledge is the core curriculum foundation. I don't think anyone would argue with it. And he said that everyone needs something called cultural literacy, and that they are facts, ideas, literary works that people need to know in order to operate as a citizen in the country. Okay, and he says that cultural literacy is often missing in schools, and what he noted is that those that are successful in life, that have that really progress, often do have access to this cultural literacy. So he has sort of presented an organised, structured way, core knowledge curriculum calls it, for children, and he does mean children, primarily, he's talking about primary school here, although it's been used, his work has been used in the UK in a secondary school to apply to secondary schools. Anyway, so his focus is early years primary school. Now, Hirsch's work was unearthed by a more right-leaning think tank called Civitas, and it's been claimed that his work on knowledge has influenced government education policy, and particularly the revised national curriculum in 2013-14. That curriculum was said to move away, and it does, let's face it does move away from an explicit focus on concepts and processes and skills, which was all over the 2008 curriculum. It basically gave equal footing to concepts, skills, and content. So you had a three-way curriculum that looked at all three, towards one which is much more focused on knowledge. Taking citizenship as an example, it's a very short curriculum, so a very slimmed down compared to the 2008 version. It's 2 pages long. Approximately a page and a half is all about the content at Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. This is what has to be learned in terms of knowledge. It gives broad knowledge areas. It does, in its earlier elements, talk about what skills need to be learned. It talks about critical thinking. It talks about researching. I think it talks about balancing opinions and debating, and I think it talks about participating in volunteering and other forms of responsible action. So they're the 4 skills that are clocked, but there's really no detail on those. Whereas in the 2008 version, it was much more detailed and much more explicit, the range of skills that needed to be taught, in addition to key core concepts. Identity and diversity was one of those. Democracy and justice was one of those, and advocacy. I can't actually think it's not advocacy, that's a skill. I can't actually think what the 3rd or 4th concepts were, but anyway, so there's a real big shift in the sense. Well, is there a big shift? I don't know, because the content was pretty similar. It's a slimmed down content. We've lost a focus on environmental issues. We've lost some focus on global issues at Key Stage 3. We've lost some. What else have we lost? We've gained a little bit about of financial education as explored previously. Lost a bit of economic education. So it's actually still been slimmed down, but essentially because concepts have gone and because skills have gone, the centrality of knowledge is therefore expanded. And that is replicated in the way that they've moved away from coursework and the development through coursework of skills, particularly citizenship, which used to be 60% coursework through an active citizenship project. So they've replicated or applied the content-focused curriculum to GCSE structure. So now it is assessment at the end of the course only, no modules, no coursework, and the syllabus that were produced. And interestingly, the syllabus, which is based on the curriculum, were also created through the government, not at arm's length from the government either, as they used to be. There used to be an organisation called the Qualifications and Curriculums Authority, which used to produce the national curriculum, but now it's explicitly done by the Department for Education and ministers themselves. There were rumourings that the inclusion of Black Rod in the GCSE Citizenship Studies specifications is particularly because of the insistence of one particular education minister. But anyway, so there we go. So that's a kind of translation of core knowledge principles into the national curriculum in England. So those that have taken on this policy, it was really first, we've got the 5 Conservative Secretaries of State for Education here. 2010, it was Michael Gove. Then it became Nicky Morgan. Actually, I'm wrong here. It's only 4 with Nick Gibb. He's throughout all 4 Secretary of States for Education. Nick Gibb has remained an education minister. So he's the kind of constant through all the change and the quite rapid change of ministers. So we've got Michael Gove, Nicky Morgan, Justine Greening, and now Damien Hines. And to be honest, there's much less focus now on the theory behind new curriculum, what have you. It was Michael Gove that brought it in, so that forced through a lot of big change, and then ever since, education ministers have been trying to often deal with other issues actually within education. Some are the curriculum in a sense has much less relevance because it's disapplied and not doesn't academies don't have to follow it. They often choose to follow large parts of it, but they don't have to. So Damien Hines, for example, his big focus is supposedly reducing teacher workload and what have you, but we actually haven't heard much from him on a sort of ideological or theoretical or curriculum from a curriculum standpoint. So anyway, now although it's been adopted by first the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition and then the Conservatives since 2015, it is worth asking the question whether or not it's actually a right-wing endeavour, because Hirsch would argue its foundations are, knowledge is power. This is all about giving underprivileged children equal access and entitlement to knowledge, which effectively has made other more privileged people powerful, he would argue. So surely that is much more of a social justice argument. And, Hirsch would argue that something so important as illiteracy must be tackled if groups that are hitherto excluded stand any chance of bridging gaps in inequality. And a lack of core knowledge thereby reduces social mobility, damages social cohesion and democratic participation. Now, one of the problems is the way that the core knowledge has been interpreted and taken on by some schools means that while this may be the case, some schools, as a result, are spending so much time trying to build up literacy within students and focusing on a very narrow curriculum. The ultimate effect is to actually reduce democratic participation, certainly within school, because they're not educating students in citizenship and in political literacy. So while they may be improving literacy, they're not necessarily, or to what degree are such schools teaching kids to think and to think politically and critically as citizens versus young people that are just trying to compete in a jobs market or what have you. Anyway, so in the USA, Hirsch would I think admit this is he's much more of a left-wing educationalist or considered to be so. So to what degree has his work been appropriated by the right here in the UK? I think I wanted, I'm not quite sure why I've got this in here, but this was the 2008 curriculum and a big picture of it. And in a sense, I guess what I'm trying to show is to be honest, I think this is pointless, so we're just going to move on. I don't know why I've kept this in here. I guess somewhere in there is knowledge, but at the same point, somewhere in there is skills and concepts. So I think... let's move on. I think the important thing to consider is a couple of examples of schools which may or may not have taken on this core knowledge kind of approach. The most well-known and I would recommend thinking about and learning about this school, is a school called Michaela, and this now famous book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Teachers, edited by the head teacher or executive head teacher of Michaela. And what they really, really do, they've been a successful school. They're a model that other schools have been to see. It is very, very clear what students have to learn in schools like this. They have something called knowledge organisers. This is an example knowledge organiser from science, but this will be introduced to students very early on in their science learning of this particular topic. And so they will know overall, they'll see an overview of exactly what they have to learn. In a sense, that helps a student really consider, take more responsibility for their own learning. They then build on those knowledge organisers with lots of repetition, lots of oracy, lots of quizzing and testing as to the learning of such things. And that has helped build this kind of foundation of core knowledge into their school. Now, it's interesting, though, as I said before, that they only offer a stripped down curriculum. They don't offer, and specifically don't offer, citizenship. In fact, if you Google search under jobs for citizenship in London, Michaela School always comes up. And it always comes up because they explicitly talk about how they don't teach citizenship, which is so interesting given their tagline. Their tagline is about power, and yet there is a huge, I would argue this as a citizenship specialist, but there's a huge tranche of knowledge that is not being taught, and I think that is a dereliction of the duty of a school to not teach political literacy and participation, to not allow students to really think deeply about identity and diversity and discrimination and all of these kind of things. I think is immensely problematic. But anyway, but what do you think? Go read the book. Go read about the school, because there's a lot of people that have been to visit, and a lot of people have lots of good things to say. And I have to say, pedagogically speaking, they may have these organisers, and it may, this school would be criticised for having a dry, decontextualised, boring curriculum. But actually, a lot of the kids really enjoy the kind of learning. And I think there is some exciting learning going on. It's about how, there's some good principles at practice here. There is great use of, in a limo terms, the out. So lots of quizzing and testing. There's real clarity about what students have to learn, and probably why as well, which links to our link and our in. So there's some good practice going on there. On the flip side, and often these schools are directly contrasted, there is School 21 based in Stratford, and School 21 essentially has at its heart a project-based learning approach where learning is applied as far as possible to the real world. So if you look on its website, it's got, these are locations across London where its students are involved in real world projects. Their projects are all about answering key questions. They have big overarching questions that the students then go out and explore and try and find answers to. They'll often create material as a result that has a public outcome and an audience, such as this documentary about homelessness in the borough. They have big showcases of their work. So again, students' work is publicly displayed. And a lot of these things, a real focus on oracy and debate and using one's voice in the classroom and beyond. And all of this, in a sense, is what I would characterize as a very citizenship-rich approach. So citizenship is embedded throughout the curriculum. And to some degree, that's surely got to be the holy grail of every citizenship teacher, not just to be teaching citizenship in isolation in their own subject, but actually to have influenced how history is taught, how geography is taught, how science is taught, so that students have a real world impact beyond just one subject and throughout their schooling. Wow. So I again encourage you to go and investigate School 21. So there we go. I think perhaps downside, I'm not sure the degree to which they do. I would very much contend, although it may have a citizenship ethos, I would also always argue that you require citizenship specialists to teach that politics, that law, that identity and diversity, that human rights. You absolutely need the specialists and a specialist subject to deliver that. And I'm not sure the degree to which they do that. So anyway, that's another point. Anyway, the general tension here, if there is a tension at all, I don't know. But the classical tension is positing knowledge against skills, okay? And I've used the word caricatures because essentially when the 2013-14 curriculum was introduced, it was done so... It was done in a political way. It was said, the previous curriculum was just about skills. It lacked academic. It wasn't academic. It lacked rigor and what have you. It was all about process and what have you. And it wasn't. It lacked the core knowledge. And at the same time, proponents of a more rounded education would say that an exclusively knowledge-focused approach is boring, it's inaccessible. A lot of it will be knowledge about powerful people and knowledge that powerful people think is important, as opposed to the knowledge of students' lived experience. So there's these two kind of camps arguing against each other. And to some degree, they're both caricatures. I mean, this is what's important. Skills do still have a place to play. The degree to which the government has removed that at GCSE because it's moved away from coursework that's a significant question, and it'll only really be revealed to you when you go out into your schools and start teaching the GCSE, the degree to which the skills that one could and should develop through citizenship have been eroded at the expense of knowledge and exam skills. How to actually write a long answer question. That's not a citizenship skill. That's an exam skill. So to what degree have those overtaken the deep, and what I would argue are significant skills of oracy, advocacy, critical thinking, critical, media literacy, all of these kind of things. Anyway, a few points to think about Hirsch. As I've said, I'm not sure the previous version was actually that content light, I'm not sure. So there we go. And as we've just talked about, are content and skills really dichotomous educational aims? Surely, as Sir Michael Barber said, the what has to go with the how. They are inextricably linked, and should be taught simultaneously and together in a consistent way. And also, there's still the problem of who decides what is core knowledge. How do you arrive at that? Is it through some appropriation of what is common to a society? Is it is it through academic discourse, or is it an attempt to an ideological attempt to teach about and maintain a status quo, so to teach about the powerful and what have you. So some things to think about. In contrast, a slight contrast to Eric Hirsch, is Michael Young's work. Over the last 4 or 5 years, he's published quite widely on the notion of powerful knowledge. He's worked here at the UCL Institute of Education for over half a century, and his notion of powerful knowledge has become quite widely read and disseminated in educational circles. So he says powerful knowledge is different from what he calls pupils' everyday knowledge. And that's, their lived experience knowledge that they will bring in from their lives outside of the classroom, outside of school, whatever they've picked up. So it's different from what he calls everyday knowledge. It's also, he would say, different from the knowledge of the powerful camp, because he would say this is knowledge that is specialist, that is discipline derived, so it comes from rigorous academic disciplines, and it enables explanations and predictions to be made about the world and the way the world works and is made effectively. And you have to have, as a result, subject specialists to teach such knowledge. You cannot, he would critique Hirsch's approach. You cannot have books full of knowledge that is slightly decontextualized and can be taught by anyone. It is absolutely context dependent, so you need subject specialists to teach it. He maintains that powerful knowledge is changeable, is malleable. It's if a teacher is at the cutting edge of that subject discipline, there will be tensions and knowns and unknowns around the development of that discipline. So that knowledge can be questioned, and students should be allowed to question that knowledge and bring questioning into their learning. Now, he also, in a similar way to Hirsch, he says access to this knowledge must be an entitlement for all. So there's a strong social justice argument, but he does admit that teachers face big challenges in enabling all students to access that knowledge, because it is different from students' lived experience. So that you face difficulties in working out how to connect students who may have experiences a long way away, from the corridors of power in Westminster, let's say. Maybe they've never even visited Parliament. Maybe they've never even seen a debate on TV. How do you connect the two, and what have you? So that's an overview of powerful knowledge. Usefully, he's written, young and somebody who's a few doors down from me, have written a book, kind of maps out these different approaches to schooling and the creation of a curriculum. He says, he kind of does it, the sort of structure he uses is mapping out 3 different potential futures for a given school or a number of schools. The first one is very based on factual information, and he says, that is tested through examination. So the curriculum is designed around curriculum performance, exam performance, and external measurement. And he sees this as a learning straitjacket. It doesn't adapt for all students, and it will always privilege some students who are more adapt or have resources to be able to succeed in such a narrow system. And he talks about recent changes to examinations, to curricula, as mirroring this first future. The second future he's equally critical of, and he says this is much more skills-based, it's much more experience-based, it's much more learner-centric. The position of knowledge is relegated, the focus is on everyday knowledge, and it neglects powerful knowledge. It's all about what the students think, and it's not really taking their knowledge further and building their own powerful knowledge. And that he posits as the second potential future. And the third potential future, no surprises, he talks about powerful knowledge with a strong subject basis, teachers at the cutting edge of developments in the subject, and also them making it accessible to all students, not just some. So there we go. some critique of Michael Young. There's a really nice video. There's a couple of videos actually where Michael Young is at the IOE and he's presenting to an audience of geographers, and he lays out the basic principles of powerful knowledge, and then a specialist geographer herself comes back at him in a second video explaining how everyday student knowledge actually is really, really key and important to a subject such as geography. And I would absolutely argue the same for citizenship. True. Others would also say that, there's still that problem. Well, I think he defines powerful knowledge in the book in terms of, being the best of what is. Actually, no, I'm getting my lines confused with Michael Gove. But how do you define? How do you decide what is powerful knowledge? I mean, he would maintain that it should be down to schools and subject specialists and what have you. But still, they are in. There are power relations at play. There are biases at play, and to what degree may certain groups be excluded from that process. And the third point is that there are pedagogical demands on teachers to ensure that all, that engagement and access question. If powerful knowledge is at times more high level, more abstract, more conceptual, then it is going to be harder to ensure all students can access that knowledge, and teachers are going to have to work hard in order to do that. Anyway, so there we go. So powerful knowledge. There's a very short introduction. I'd recommend going and reading this book as a starting point. And I think we've actually got the PDFs of the most important chapters on the Google Drive. So go have a look at that. Right, so that's the kind of knowledge argument. I think it's probably best represented by that slide there. Very, very simple. But it has a very important part to play in current debates about the curriculum and the way that schooling is heading in England. Okay, moving on. Let's think about Roger Hart quickly. His influence is mainly on the notion, in terms of citizenship, the notion of active citizenship. And he created something called the Ladder of Participation back in 92, a little while ago, that is a really important tool to think about when you are designing active citizenship experiences. And he talks about the importance of essentially giving students an authentic voice and an authentic say in projects in which they are trying to affect change, and not doing so in a kind of tokenistic or showy way for other means. It has to be in order to give students an authentic autonomy in running and developing their own projects. Anyway, he defined participation as the process of sharing decisions which affect one's life and the life of the community in which one lives. I feel myself that builds really well on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 12, which essentially, when you boil it down, talks about young people having a right to have a say on decisions that affect them. It's officially titled The Right of the Child to be Heard, but anyhow. Okay, so that's the Ladder of Participation essentials. He adapted Arnstein's ladder analogy for adult public participation, then applied it to young people. And he created 8 steps or levels representing a continuum, right down from something he called manipulation, all the way up, level 8, to child-initiated decisions shared with adults. So the bottom level would be manipulation, as in by adults, all the way up to something which is almost entirely child-run. So there we go. Now, he also said that levels 1 to 3, manipulation, decoration, and what he called tokenism, he said, well, they are just not participation at all. Students aren't really, they have no autonomy in these levels, whereas the higher levels, 4 to 8, mid to higher levels, he described as actual participation. Let's have a look at what this ladder actually looks like then. Here it is. Press pause on the video to kind of get a sense of this. As we've said, first 3 levels, he said this is non-participation, and 4 to 8, he said this is actual participation. And it's interesting. I mean, think about it. Think about where we sit in terms of the current active citizenship projects that we're going to be taking part in this year. So, to what degree is the project, or where does it sit? Where does it sit within this? Is it non-participation? Is it up here? I don't know. I have my my sense of where it is, but it's the kind of thing you need to think about. These examples really help, by the way, because when you're coming up with your active citizenship projects and what have you, teaching active citizenship as part of the citizenship GCSE, they still have to do an active citizenship project. So to what degree are you going to put student autonomy as a key design or part of the design of your project? Or are you just going to assign, well, we're going to pick this charity and we're going to investigate it, and then we're going to write a letter to the MP to our local MP? How much are you going to define it versus how much are you going to involve and make autonomous the groups or class that you might be working with. Anyway, so there we go. So there's a few benefits of getting more authentic student-led participation. Motivation is increased. When you allow students to make decisions, it obviously builds their reasoning skills, their planning skills, their negotiation skills. But when you make those choices for them, that takes all that away. And actually the experience of undertaking projects obviously starts a virtual cycle where the next time they're more likely to participate more quickly, more authoritatively, based on their previous experiences. So there we go. Now, importantly, he doesn't say, Hart doesn't say that the top of the ladder is always preferable. It depends on the context. He himself used the example of Lord of the Flies and what could potentially go wrong. And it's worth thinking about, would you always want a project to be entirely organised and run by students? Isn't our job as citizenship teachers to help them, if we're talking real world learning, well, adults pepper the real world, so surely them working with adults is almost more appropriate than just children alone deciding everything and then informing adults, because it really doesn't reflect the real world. And I guess there's a whole lot of skills that they will learn in negotiating and liaising with adults and what have you, and communicating with them, that they wouldn't otherwise. The other point is that you need to think about, is this just about letting groups, decide who they want to be on their own and letting them run free? Because what could potentially happen there is students who are already privileged, who already have access to resources, maybe parents who know how to organise projects and can support them in doing so, or have had experience of trying to affect change and run campaigns. Often if you do just allow groups to go off on their own without any structured guidance or support or scaffolding, you'll find that certain more privileged groups may run with those projects much further, much faster than others. So how do you as a teacher ensure that everyone makes progress and everyone is supported, but at the same time don't overly reduce their autonomy? This is really important to think about. Right, critique of the ladder of participation. A number of authors out there have had a peep at Hart's ladder of participation. Some have talked about the linearity of the ladder, as if you have to, as if, as I've said, it's more of a positive thing to go up the ladder, whereas actually it depends on the circumstance and the context, what may be more appropriate, and what have you. What do Cook and Cathari say? They said it's the new tyranny, and always involving others and always involving young people or involving what they would call stakeholders, actually may lead to people. Sometimes it's just not appropriate to involve students in every decision and what have you. To what degree, are you? Do you actually need, and will it be beneficial to give students full choice over active citizenship projects or campaigns? You as an expert in the classroom will have expertise to give, and therefore sometimes you will quite rightly limit choice or direct effort, student effort. Finally, I think this is an important contribution. These folks, not going to attempt a pronunciation, warn against dichotomizing parents and children's rights as if they're in opposition. And I think that's really important. Particularly, and they put here, and I've talked about this at length, when certain groups, both children and parents, may themselves be marginalised through various causes, class, race, and gender, for example. These points are taken from a useful publication looking into Hart's ladder of participation from Hudson 2012. That's the link. Okay. Right, moving on. Let's have to do a time check, and I may actually pause things because, hold on. Okay, quickly going to pause. Okay, just lose that. Okay, the next kind of series of things we're going to look at are learning styles and people that have contributed to learning style theories or literature. And perhaps one of the most influential is this chap called Howard Gardner from Harvard University, who's a developmental psychologist. And he built on principles like this. So Albert Einstein once wrote, I'm sure you may have seen this quote, "Everybody's a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." What's Einstein getting at here? He's saying, essentially, there are very different abilities within a class of young people, and very narrow assessment, which only priorities certain abilities, will have a detrimental effect to a whole heap of kids that have different types of abilities and knowledge bases and intelligences. So this is the starting point, in a sense, for Howard Gardner's work. And he basically, this underlies his principles. So he says it's not about how smart you are, it's about how you're smart. Everyone is smart, but everyone's smart in a different way. People have multiple intelligences, or the multiple intelligences exist. So he identified 7, possibly 8 different types of intelligence. He called them linguistic, logical, mathematical, musical, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. he said that these different forms, and just Google Gardner for an explanation of each one. But essentially, he said that schools focus heavily on logical and linguistic forms of intelligence, and actually to the detriment of all these other forms of intelligence. Therefore, those who have particular preferences for these types are neglected and don't do so well in a heavily logical, linguistic school system. Now, there we go. And in a sense, it makes a lot of logical sense, that in a very exam-focused, narrow curriculum, you're going to have particular people with particular aptitude towards a narrow form of teaching, a narrow form of a narrow kind of subject content range, are going to flourish more than others who have a range of skills which, because of narrowing of the curriculum, or because teachers are pressured to teach to tests and what have you, and get through more and more content rather than exploring things in different musical spatial ways, social ways, movement, using movement and what have you. That is going to lead to some students succeeding and others perhaps not. So on a kind of elemental level, it kind of makes sense. Anyhow, there's plenty of other kind of constructions out there in addition to multiple intelligences, which have been referred to as learning styles. Most popular, or the one you see all over the place, is the VAC model: visual, auditory, kinesthetic. And to the extent that you see, and I very much used to do this. I used to say, "Oh yeah, I'm a visual learner. I'm a visual learner." Full stop. And I think we'll come on to potential problems with these. But the VAC model has its roots in psychology and neuro-linguistic programming. So there we go. Critique-wise, and this is important, there is a danger when you have when you take on board learning styles, when you ascribe particular learning styles to particular students. And as a result, so okay, this gentleman, let's say Hen over here, is a visual learner. So I'm going to give Hen a visual task to do to learn that particular content. I'm going to give, this person over here, I'm going to give them, a text to read because they are an auditory learner, or I'm going to read a text to them, or what have you. Now, the problem with that is that, so if you're just learning in your own learning style, or supposed learning style, to what degree do you develop as a rounded human? You're pigeonholing yourself, students in that sense. So surely they need to develop a range of styles. So making accommodation for their style may actually stop them from learning. Or impinge their development because they don't become familiar with learning through other means. So there's also the danger of students pigeonholing themselves. I can't do that because I'm not that kind of learner. The other major thing that's come out in the last 10 years is that actually, despite the ubiquitousness of learning styles, kind of approaches and information in schools, there's actually a lack of evidence out there. Have a look at Pashler et al. I think, again, it's on the Google Drive. There's a lack of evidence that say that learning styles almost exist and that the approaches work. So now, in a sense, and I remember doing a good bit of research into these, some people have said, that there's research out there that just proves that learning styles don't work. Okay, But that's not true. There's just a lack of evidence that they do work, which doesn't mean that they don't, if you see what I mean. But it just hasn't been proven that they do. But it certainly hasn't been proven that they don't. So, so more research is needed in this kind of area. But I think it was important for some authors, Pashler et al., etc., to do research into, to have a look at whether or not these things, because of their ubiquity in educational circles, it's important for them to look at whether or not there was research to back this up. There's not, but that doesn't mean we should throw everything out. It's always worth thinking about the consequences for the classroom. It's really important that we as teachers don't pigeonhole students. X is this, Y is this. I personally would always use the word learning style preference. If you go back to this video, I'm sure I used it previously. So we may have preferences, but it's important to build an all-round aptitude for different types of learning. And variety, the last 2 points here, variety is really the key, and it remains good practice to include a variety of experiences, learning approaches in your lessons, because you're going to develop skills, students in a holistic way, developing multiple, let's use it, intelligences and aptitudes and skills by doing so. And if you yourself use a straitjacket of one or two, if you're talking just all the time, you're just lecturing mode, to what degree is that building that wide range of skill and aptitude in your students? I don't know. Anyway, so there we go. I think we're almost at the end, because I don't think, I've gone on long enough, and we're not going to get on to Kohlberg. I don't think in this one we'll do that in a lecture. But I think it's important at this point to review the work of David Kolb, who we introduced right at the beginning of the course this year. So he made two major and related contributions, which we're going to map out. The first is his experiential learning theory, or learning cycle. Okay, we've looked at that already. And then what he called his learning styles inventory, which is based on the experiential learning cycle. So to recap on that cycle, it's a 4-part cycle. Talks about having a concrete experience. So there we go. Reflecting on that experience, conceiving or conceptualizing that experience, and then kind of planning or trying out what you've learned to then have that experience again. And I think we came up with some words which represented each phase as teachers. So we ourselves are going through, as we learn to teach, an experiential learning cycle. But Kolb's point was that he wants students, and students should be going through this cycle themselves. And to some degree, Limo does, I guess, link to this in terms of concrete experience. This may be the mix, but it doesn't wholly, because surely we need to afford students time to reflect on what they've learned and what have you. So that's why this, maybe this whole cycle is embedded within the mix. That if you actually have students experientially learning, planning a project, or planning a solution to a problem they've been given, then trying it out, and then reflecting on whether or not their solution worked, and then conceiving of why that may or may not have been, to some degree that itself is a mix, and then your monitoring of that process would be your out, I guess. And I guess the in would be mixed in with that, as they plan and they hypothesize and then they try out. So anyway, I'm getting myself confused. All right. So what are the consequences for the classroom of this model? Well, number one, there's a million. If you type this into Google, there's a million different versions of this. I think this is an interesting model. Well, actually, I'm going to start that again because I think what I want you to do is just think about, okay, how can we use this in the classroom? I've done a bit of that, but it is important to think about, okay, we want students to have experiences and have, again, I think it links to Roger Hart's ladder of participation. If we want students to have authentic, deep learning experiences, we need, in a sense, to give them the opportunity to do all of these things themselves. So this is separate from our own experiential learning cycle. They need those experiences themselves. Anyway, lots of different versions of around. They all follow the same principles and what have you. This is interesting because we now link to what he called his learning styles inventory. Now, there's a bit of critique here, first of all, in that whoever's created this one, and this is common to a lot of the experiential learning cycle representations that exist out there. You've got the concrete experience described as feeling. You've got a reflective observation described as watching, abstract conceptualization described as thinking, and then active experimentation described as doing. Well, surely concrete experience is doing, but I guess you're feeling it at the same time. So there's real overlap. And we talked about this before. There's massive overlap between these two. Anyway, David Kolb actually broke this down into two continuums, what he called a perception continuum here on the y-axis and a processing continuum on the x-axis, how we do things and how we think about things. And then he divided his cycle into 4 segments of sort of learning style preferences. So in any given part of the learning, the experiential learning cycle, you'll get people who prefer to learn through certain elements of the cycle. They're more comfortable in certain elements. So you get reflectors who like to feel and watch what's going on, and they learn through that. You get activists who like to feel and do. So that's the combination of these two. You get pragmatists who like to do and think and then do. And you get a theorist, who like to watch and then think and not necessarily participate. Now, in a sense, I think, yeah, that sort of works. I mean, it sort of falls down on, I don't know, on some bits, but a pragmatist like to think and do because they're thinking rather than feeling. I guess, I don't know. Does an activist not want to think at all and not want to reflect? Anyway. But again, if you go to critique, this has been widely critiqued. First of all, the model itself. There was a limited research base into the model, and it was said that research number, I don't know how many it was and what the context was, but it was too small to form the generalization that Kolb formed. And Caulfield et al. Actually, in their review of learning styles research and evidence, say, well, there's little evidence of any impact of this cycle being proven. In terms of the inventory, I mean, as I've already gone through, the terminology is blancmange, as I would, I don't know if you have ever eaten blancmange, but it's a wibbly wobbly and opaque, open to interpretation. And again, there's sort of limited applicability. I mean, I would argue it's useful, but again, It's useful because it's sort of it feels as if there's grains of truth in this, but surely I think that the consequences for us are very similar to the consequences from the other work we've looked at on learning styles. We want to develop students as rounded individuals, so we need to help them become not just better reflectors, if that's what they prefer, but also theorists, pragmatists, and activists, and what have you. So it's developing students in the round rather than just developing one preference, and what have you. Is there anything else? Yeah, Pastor et al. Again, that overview of the evidence suggests that again, the learning styles and learning styles inventory, there's little evidence of its validity. Right, so there we go. That is, we're through almost everything except Kohlberg, but we'll do that at some point in the classroom if we get time. I just wanted to flag up this, though. I found this, it was created by Richard Millward down here. And it's a really interesting, very accessible, although a lot of information here, overview of a lot of different learning theories, and a lot of the ones that we have covered over the last couple of videos are here. So you've got Skinner, Bloom, Gardner, Azubel, Brunner, Vygotsky, Piaget. Dewey I've had a look at, sort of. You'll have heard of Montessori schools. Freire we've covered. Illich we haven't, but he's historically he's against the notion of schooling and how it perpetuates a status quo, and the damage that does on students. Kolb we've looked at, but there's another, there's a range of other theorists in here which might spark your interest. And what's useful is that he's summarized their contributions here, and then with a keyword, and then explained roughly each theory around here. So I think that's pretty useful as an accessible summary of some of the approaches we've covered over the last couple of videos. And he's also looked at the connections between some of the disciplines at play here. So here we go. Righty-ho, there we go. There's your reference list. I don't think it's exhaustive, but again, this PowerPoint will be available, and you can just click on the links through to various PDFs and what have you. And a lot of the stuff you will find in the Google Drive. Right, sorry, I've gone on for exactly 1.5 hours. Oh my god, 90 minutes. So we're going to stop right there, and remember to dip into the bits of this video that you find useful. It hopefully will also be useful when you come to writing your portfolio and your report on your portfolio, which is MA Assignment 1. All the best.